This is part two of a three-part series where we are going through the short, but it's a really powerful book, a small book, one chapter only. It's called the book of Jude. And the book of Jude is all about contending for faith or talking about this idea of capital T truth, talking about biblical truth, spiritual truth, God's truth, what we see reflected in Scripture. And I think now more than ever, the way I see it, I'm sure the way you see it, is that the world isn't really wanting to live like there's any definitive truth anymore. The Bible tells us that there's going to be this day and age where people aren't concerned about capital T truth. They're not worried about God's law. They're not worried about what the Bible has to say on how they should live. And the Bible actually tells us that there will be a day and age when people will do just whatever they want to do, and they'll call that their truth. And I believe that we're living in that day and age now. Now, the book of Jude, it's really centered around on Jude asking us to keep our eyes out for something that Jesus said would happen, which is that there's this idea of wolves in sheep's clothing, is what Jesus called it. And Jude, or writing after the life of Christ, is still talking about the wolves in sheep's clothing, talking about how there's going to be people who are saying they're truly following Jesus, but really there's this malicious intent happening just under the surface. They're not really faithfully following Jesus. They're saying they're following Jesus. They're going through the motions without a heart change for their own crooked ways. And in today's passage, we're just going to cover a few scriptures of Jude. He pulls no punches. He's very blunt. He's very straight to the point regarding people who are truly involved in the early church communities. But they have no desire to live, love, or lead in the ways that Christ has called us as followers of him to live, love, and lead. And so here's what Jude has to say. And we're going to skip around a little bit, beginning in verse 10. He says, "But these people, they scoff at things they do not understand. Like unthinking animals, they do whatever their instincts tell them. And so they bring about their own destruction." And skipping to verse 12, he says, "When these people eat with you in your fellowship meals, commemorating the Lord's love, they're like dangerous reefs that can shipwreck you. They're like shameless shepherds who care only for themselves. They're like clouds blowing over the land without giving any rain. They're like trees in the autumn that are doubly dead, for they bear no fruit and have been pulled up by the roots. They're like wild waves of the sea, churning up the foam of their shameful deeds. They're like wandering stars, doomed forever to blackest darkness." In verse 16, he says, "These people are grumblers and complainers, living only to satisfy their desires. They brag loudly about themselves, and they flatter others to get what they want." Nobody can ever accuse Jude of beating around the bush. He points it out clear as day. And I know what happens in most of us when we read or we hear those blunt words all strung together to create this description of an individual. A lot of us, we start thinking of others. We start thinking of other people who say they follow Christ, who say that they're devoted to Jesus, but the evidence of their life doesn't really support that. It's people who are void of love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and gentleness, faithfulness, self-control. The fruit of the Spirit, the fruit of the Spirit is the evidence in our lives of when we are connected to Christ. And so when we hear Jude's words, we think about people who aren't displaying that evidence. And I think that's certainly natural for us to point out the lack of faithfulness in others when they are missing it. But I think the application that Jude wants us to walk away with is maybe just a layer deeper. There's something else happening here when we interact with the words of Jude. And although certainly there are people in our lives who we know fit the bill, we can read what Jude said there, what we just covered with one another, and say, man, I know people just like that, right? People who aren't even mindful of the ways that they are drifting. But I think what's happening just below the surface is Jude is saying, are we being mindful of the way that maybe we are drifting? I've heard it said before, maybe you've heard something to this effect, but I've heard it said that no one ever planned to become an alcoholic after their first sip. And nobody ever claimed to be an addict after their first hit. right? But using Jude's language here in a similar manner, nobody ever plans to become a shipwreck to people, right? Keeping with Jude's words here, nobody ever starts off following Jesus and says, I hope that one day I'm like a rainless cloud that's going to let people down. When we start following Jesus, we don't aim to become wild waves that bring about destruction to other people's lives. That's never our intention, and I don't know, maybe it was never these individuals' intention that Jude is talking about. Falling away from Jesus and falling away from treating people the way that Jesus would want us to treat them. Unfortunately, it happens one unfaithful moment at a time. But when it comes to calling out the flaws in other people, Jesus says, don't just settle for that. Don't just read the words of Jude here and just say, yeah, we're out for those people. They're not really following Jesus. Jesus says, hold up. Here's what he says in Matthew. He says, and why worry about a speck in your friend's eye when you have a log in your own? How can you think of saying to your friend, let me help you get rid of that speck in your eye, when you can't see past the log in your own eye? Hypocrite. This is Jesus. He says, hypocrite. First, get rid of the log in your own eye. Then you'll see well enough to deal with the speck in your friend's eye. Jesus kind of flips the script here and says, it's not just about you pointing out the flaws in other people. It's not just about you seeing the evidence of them falling away from me. It's not just about like this checklist of the fruit of the Spirit. Do I see love to that person? Nah, they must not be following Jesus. Do I see goodness? Not that I see. Do I see peace and patience? Jesus is saying, hang on. It's first and foremost about looking in your heart as well. Not getting so focused and caught up on other people's mistakes or shortcomings and behaviors at the expense of maybe dealing with these small red flags that are coming up in our own heart. Jesus is saying, my beloved, don't you understand? It's not just about you pointing out other people's flaws. It's about seeing just the small ways that crookedness or sin are starting to take root in your heart as well. It's not just about pointing out the bad examples of following Jesus. It's about making sure you're faithfully following Jesus. And I wonder what would happen if we took this seriously. What would happen in the hearts of other people who aren't faithfully following Jesus if we prayed for them as much as we talk about them? What would happen in the hearts of other people who are struggling to follow Jesus and not showing the evidence of the fruit of the Spirit if we prayed for them more than we pointed at them as the bad example? I want to be clear when we talk about Jesus calls us to turn it around a little bit and to look at ourselves. I don't want us to think that means we have to excuse negative behavior all the time in our lives. I don't think that means that we put up with spiritual abuse from church leaders. That we just blindly follow poor leadership because we think, well, who knows, maybe one day I would be a poor leader. No, that's not what this is about. It's about being honest and seeing what is happening through somebody's routine behavior. And then going to the Lord regularly to pray for them, but to also say, Lord, show me where I'm coming up short. God, show me where I'm drifting away from you. In the first teaching of this series in the book of Jude, Jeff, our senior pastor, he highlighted how what Jude's trying to get these early followers of Jesus to do is he's trying to inspire them to contend for their faith. That's the way that some people, some translations put it, to contend for the faith. Some say to fight for the faith, right? Fight for truth. This truth of Christ against all opposition, this truth of the way that he calls us to live. Fight for that. Hang on to it against all odds. I want to finish up here in a similar manner, but I think with maybe a slightly different application. Because certainly you and I, we know that there are people out there who are giving following Jesus a bad reputation. Right? They're not as close to him as they want other people to believe, and their lack of fruit of the Spirit, the lack of the evidence of them following Christ closely is hurting people. Right? We all know people like that. We know that some people have labeled themselves as a Christian, but they're not living, loving, or leading as Christ lived, loved, or led. And it's hurting people. It's causing people to walk away from churches forever, to look at faith and say, I can't believe in Jesus and this whole thing in Christianity if that's how people represent Jesus, if that's how they represent Christ. That was what was happening thousands of years ago in these early church communities, and unfortunately not a lot has changed since Jude put pen to paper. But how, in light of the text today, can we contend for faith? Can we fight for faith? Well, I think it begins with understanding that for better or worse, in the church, we all matter. You and I, in the way we live, love, and lead, we are each one of us giving the church the reputation it has today. One by one, we are coming together and giving faith a reputation for faithless people. And there's so much about other people's faith that you and I, we just don't get to control. It's not up to us. We are not judge and jury of it. There's so much that we don't control. But our own heart tethered to Christ, that's what we get to control. And so I want to challenge you with these thoughts as we start to close. What would people think about faith in Jesus if your faith in Jesus is the only one they knew? What would our church look like? Right? If everyone followed Jesus as faithfully as you are. Or if you're watching with a group of people, like what would people think of Mount Pleasant Christian Church if they were taking faith as seriously as your entire group of people you're watching this with? Today, I think that the best ways that we can contend for faith and contend for truth today is by looking inwardly. Saying, God, show me where I've gone adrift. Don't let me get caught up in that behavior and that knee-jerk reaction of always pointing out where other people are drifting. Jesus, the Holy Spirit, convict me of where I'm drifting. And as we go about our faith, I can promise you we are not going to be perfect. We are in just as much need of grace as other people that we could point to and say, man, they're missing it. So we're not going to be perfect, but we can, through our devotion to Christ, through admitting we need grace, we can point people towards that perfect God. And you and I, we only have so much life to live, and we've got that baton, and while we're here on earth and we're running our race, it's our goal to live our life here on earth in a way that can point people to the afterlife in heaven.